Well, a very warm welcome to everyone who's joined us this morning. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Professor Brian Webster Henderson. I'm Chair of the Council of Deans of Health, and I'm a Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University of Cumbria. I'm going to introduce colleagues that are joining me in this discussion and webinar this morning. Can I ask Professor David Richardson, if you could just introduce yourself, that would be great.
Thank you, Brian. Well, first of all, I'm really pleased to be joining you this morning. My name is David Richardson. I'm the Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of East Anglia. I chair the University's UK group for providing guidance for the sector for tackling racial harassment, and I'm co-chair of the Advance HE Race Equality Charter Governance Committee.
Thank you, David, and we'll look forward to hearing you talk in a moment. And I'm also joined by my colleague, Dr. Katrina Koleva, who's Chief Executive of the Council of Deans. Katrina, do you want to say hello?
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to all our members and guests for this for today's session. Just to encourage you and invite you to put comments, recommendations, and questions in our Q&A during the talk, which we will take afterwards, and also to encourage you to follow all our activities this month with the hashtag Race Equity Month. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks very much, Katerina. So as we've just said, this is part of a webinar and part of a series of actions and communications that we're doing from the Council of Deans of Health for Race Equity Month. And it's a really important topic for us to unpack today, but it's also an opportunity for you to make comments, to raise questions. So please feel free to use the chat, and we will go into a question and answer session around white allyship and other areas that may come up. So thank you very much. At this point, I'm going to hand over to David. And David, I'll just allow you to set the scene for us and get us going this morning. So a very warm welcome to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you again, Brian. I'm probably going to spend about 15 minutes giving some personal reflections on my own role in leading the sector's efforts to tackle racism and racial harassment. And my role is that of a white ally as well. I'll refer to that a little bit. But I'm also very interested really in the value of the conversation we're going to have afterwards, and actually what I can learn from you about the challenges you're finding, in particular in the the nursing, midwifery, allied health sector more generally. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. The key, message for the next 10 minutes or so that I'll be talking to you about is the challenge of taking a really proactive anti-racist approach to tackling racism in higher education. And the situation we have, which reflects racism in higher education at the moment, and institutional racism, which I'll talk more about in a minute, is that all too often the higher education leaders, the leaders in higher education, are white, like myself. And therefore it is up to us as leaders, as white allies, as vice chancellors, principals, executive teams, governing bodies, to be active in exposing structural racism and leading the efforts to dismantle it. My starting point for this discussion, my starting point for the leadership I've been providing for Universities UK and the sector more widely, is to acknowledge that institutional racism exists. I've been the Vice Chancellor of my university for almost 8 years now, and it's actually not easy for me to say this, but the university that I'm ultimately responsible for, on my watch, perpetuates structural racism. It's institutionally racist, it's discriminatory. I stand up and I say that, and it's my job to do something about that. But it's not just true of my university, it's true of the wider UK higher education sector. And one thing I've been trying to do is to really help the other leaders in the sector stand up and acknowledge that, because only by acknowledging it can we lead change. Thinking about the events we're seeing in the news at the moment, I can't bring about change at Yorkshire County Cricket Club. I can offer some advice, I can tell you that, but I can't bring about change. Others will have to do that. But at UEA, I can. At my university, I can. And in my region, where UEA is such a major cultural and economic force, I can use that leverage as well to lead change. And that's what I'm trying to do, and that's what I would encourage all leaders to do. My university was founded in 1963. It was one of those universities that were founded on a sort of mission of social inclusion, the so-called Robbins universities at the time. Unfortunately, we were set up using the same sort of structures, actually the same colonial structures, really, that universities had been set up in the UK for many hundreds of years previous. So really, right from the outset, even though we were set up on a mission of social inclusion, on a mission of pushing, making sure that everything around what we did was equitable for everyone, actually we were set up on a basis that immediately embedded in the sort of DNA of my university structural inequities. And now, we need to acknowledge that, and we need to dismantle them and work our way through exactly what they are. Now, many of us are addressing these in all sorts of different ways, because there are many inequities, not just racial inequities in our universities, many others that you'll all be aware of. And we are addressing these through access and participation plans, Athena, Swan, race equality charters. But I do actually ask leaders to ask, how much are we really changing the DNA of our universities when we do this? And I would challenge all leaders to say that we are not making the progress that I would wish and that we should be making. So my university is institutionally racist, so is the sector. It seems to me that we spent a lot of time asking questions about whether this was really true or not, and some people still do, and in other sectors especially. But I won't spend a lot of time giving the evidence. I think the very fact we're here today suggests that you also acknowledge that. But there's lots of evidence. At my university, two equally talented students, let's say for the sake of argument, one male black student, one male white student, will arrive at UEA as new students, equally talented. And from the moment they arrive on my campus, the black student has a 20% less chance of achieving a good honours degree. A 20% less chance. Equally talented students. Why is this? And it's been this way for decades. And it's been this way for decades, not just in my university, but many other universities. It must lie in our structures. Why is there a disparity of black students progressing through PhDs at my institution and across many other institutions? Why is there less than 100 black professors across the whole of the UK? Why is the national university leadership, vice chancellors, principals, many governing bodies largely, all virtually white? It all points towards systemic structural racism. So we need to address it. We need to actually think about what we need to do, and also think about what the context now of post-COVID is, as we recognise the actual heightened impact that COVID has had, discriminatory impact that COVID has had on Black, Asian and minority ethnic students and colleagues in our sector. So, having started with accept that there is a problem, the starting point being that we don't spend time asking whether there's institutional racism in our institutes. We take that as proven, and then we move forward. Now, when I started to sort of think about how I wanted to sort of deal with this, I was cognizant of the fact that actually back in 2016, I'd been a member of the original Universities UK task force that had produced guidance for the sector on changing the culture. We called it the Changing the Culture Guidance. It was produced in 2016 for tackling violence against women, harassment and hate crimes. And I should say, whilst we are talking about racism and racial harassment today, unfortunately, many of the things that we were seeking to tackle with that guidance, 5 years ago, are still present now. We see that with the murder of Sarah Everard, for example, and recent concerns about the safety of women on campuses. But the guidance was an action-based guidance, and you can see that I've posted some things in the chat and some sort of resource links for you. And please have a look at some of this. But the guidance is link 1, and it began then by acknowledging that we had a problem and by putting in reporting systems in place to expose the full scale of the problem, and then giving guidance on how to tackle it. And this, we didn't really want to reinvent the way in which we do things at university for tackling racism. So as I'll say later, we took that framework, that change in the culture framework, as a guidance for tackling racism and racial harassment. We did some work 2 years after we released that guidance, the valuation of change in the culture. And it showed that whilst we were making progress in tackling some of the challenges that we'd sought to tackle, the violence against women, sexual harassment. And universities were putting a lot of resource into those areas, and leadership was leading initiatives in those areas, and there were good partnerships with students. It was very clear that less senior time and attention had been afforded to tackling racial harassment, and less acknowledgement of it as an issue that needed to be tackled. Around about that time, when we published this report, this evaluation 2 years on, and that's the second link I put in the chat, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission published a report called Universities Challenged. There were many reports coming out there, and actually the BMA, a report you might be more familiar with, produced a report on racial harassment experienced by trainee medics that highlighted many of the challenges that those in the health professional sector also experience whilst working in the NHS, for example. I'm happy to talk about that more later. So those two links, the EHRC and the BMA links, are also I've put in the chat as 3 and 4. So clearly, there was lots of evidence emerging that universities had a problem. But at my university, my own students were telling me that we had a problem. I was meeting with students regularly and listening firsthand to some really, really upsetting experiences that students, Black, Asian, minority ethnic students at my university in many, many different subject areas were experiencing with me. These were deeply upsetting stories I was listening to. My voice wavers now as I talk about them, and I remember them. And this was happening on my watch. I was the Vice Chancellor leading this university. I needed to lead change, and I pledged to those students then that I would. And that's where I keep coming back to that point, that we do not need to collect more evidence, repeatedly asking Asian, Black, minority ethnic students and staff to tell their stories so that we capture their experiences again and again of being victims of structural racism, only serves to re-traumatize, and it delays and it prevents us finding and implementing solutions. And I'm afraid to a degree we're seeing that a little bit with what's being played out, in the press at Yorkshire County Cricket Club. People not recognising, not wanting to accept that racism is being perpetuated by the very structures and attitudes of people in the club. And that's not unique to that. I'm not picking on them. It's in many, many places. So I pledged to my students we would take action, but we owed it to all students to take action. So through contact with Universities UK, they invited me to chair its racial harassment advisory group that we first convened back in autumn 2019. And it drew from a range of people in the sector, both in the sector actually and outside the sector. And it also had satellite groups drawn from Black, Asian and minority ethnic students, chaired by the NUS, and an equivalent Black, Asian, minority ethnic staff group as well. So we were listening to the voices of the lived experience. We were keen that it would take a problem-focused, action-oriented approach supported by case studies, and it would build on some of the success that we'd had with the original change in the culture guidance. So the new guidance was published in November 2020. That should be link 5 in the chat, and it is action-based. And it has a number of case studies to help universities implement the guidance, and those are given to you in the link 6 that I put in the chat. In fact, one of these is from my own medical school and details how we work with Black, Asian, minority ethnic students to co-create initiatives together. And we're doing similar things with the School of Health Sciences. And again, I can give you more examples in the conversation afterwards. The guidance received a lot of press coverage, and by no means all of it was positive. Some reporters and politicians clearly found what we were saying was discomforting. We were talking about critical race theory. We were talking about white privilege. We were talking about the importance of allyship, white allyship. But even the chair of the House of Commons Education Select Committee took issue with it, condemning the use of those sort of terms. Some newspaper announced that I was woke of the week. It's not a comfortable place to be. There are those in government, in power, with whom we must, of course, work, that don't acknowledge the issues that we're actually trying to tackle. In fact, the Sewell report that you will recall came to the conclusion that there was no evidence for institutional racism in the UK shortly after we published this guidance. That's a conclusion I take issue with. And that report is also in the link, the report on the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. That's also pasted into the chat. Some of the things I say is uncomfortable for sector leaders to hear, particularly white sector leaders, and they are mostly white sector leaders in the sector, unfortunately. And I'll be the first to admit that as a white person with no lived experience of racial harassment, taking action to address racism has taken me outside of my comfort zone. And I've made many, many mistakes along the way. But as leaders, we aren't doing our job effectively if we don't do anything while we have this significant proportion of our staff and students suffering from harassment, experiencing poor outcomes as a consequence, and ultimately not thriving. You know, the degree awarding gap is fundamentally an issue that sits at its root in the institutional racism we have in our organizations. So I am a white ally, and we need really the vast majority of leadership to be white allies. One day, I hope, if we're successful, 10, 15 years time, we'll have much more diversity amongst our leadership. But at the moment, this is our job, and we need to accept that and take this on. Now, I give a lot of talks on this subject, and sometimes I know that people who have the lived experience of racism and racial harassment actually feel uncomfortable with hearing a white person talking about this, with hearing a white person say that he, in my case, thinks he can understand their experiences. Well, I can't, and I don't think that, but I can lead change. But to do that, I do need to work with those people who have that lived experience. And that's what I try to do. But it can't be down to them to lead change. It can't be down to the victims to lead change. We need to do that together. We need to do that as a whole community. And we need to do it by focusing on concrete activities. So, you know, institutional racism is not just a problem of those suffering from the injustices of it. It is a problem for the whole community, and we need to take a whole community approach to solve that. So at UEA, I've set up a Vice Chancellor's Tackling Racism Task Force. So I provide personal leadership in the area for the university. It does include colleagues, staff and students who have the lived experience of racial harassment that I don't have. And it's co-chaired by a Black colleague, Colleen Cornish, who's also experienced racism, including racism in my institute. I think that co-chair model is a good one. Others can help bring the understanding of racial harassment and the experiences of racial harassment and racism, help me then understand it. But I can lead that change. I can put the resource in that's necessary to lead that change. When we published the guidance, and I'll come to a close in a moment so we can have a good conversation, we said it would be action-based, and if I can just put 10 key areas that we said people should focus on into the chat, hopefully things will pop up. Have things appeared in the chat? Let me see. Hopefully they have. Yes, they have, yeah. So I've talked about really all of these in broad terms. I'm happy to expand on them now when we go into having a conversation, but visible and meaningful senior leadership, that's what I need to provide. And that comes to the point, as we said earlier on, that requires white allyship because of the very nature of the current leadership in the sector. Incorporate the voice of lived experiences, but believe those voices. Don't keep asking people to convince you of their experiences. Develop institution-wide strategies. We own it as one community. Increase the understanding of racial harassment and its impacts throughout the university. Help people understand terminologies, create a common understanding. Increase that, how you should approach tackling racism from an anti-racist perspective. I think there are some things, listening to some of the news today and yesterday. Again, it's because it's the one that's in the news at the moment, the Yorkshire County Cricket Club thing, with some players saying they don't remember witnessing any racism. But it was happening. They don't actually necessarily understand what racism is and what defines racism. And that's where we need to educate. We need to help people to understand what it is, what covert racism looks like. And most racism in our institutions is covert rather than overt. We do need to be conscious that there are key issues now increasingly with online racial harassment. We need to focus still on developing better reporting systems that our students trust in and believe that they will be heard through those reporting systems, and they can be anonymous and non-anonymous. The previous Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, at a UUK conference 2 months ago, actually said universities should stop investing in anonymous reporting systems where people can report racial microaggressions. I thought that was an outrageous thing to say, but it reflects the fact that some in government don't believe that the issues that we're tackling actually exist. They're wrong. We need to be better at collecting and analysing the data we get on reporting. It helps us to understand the scale of the problem and maybe pockets of our institutions where those problems might be more prevalent. And we need to evaluate, and we need to share good practice. This is what we're going to do, what we did today, I hope. I will then now close, but I'll say a couple of final points. People tell me this will take time. Culture change takes time, but we haven't got time. You ask somebody who's suffering from racism and racial harassment whether we should take time over this. I can just give you a very clear answer. We haven't got time. The sector can be slow to change, but in March 2020, when we went into lockdown, we managed to put the entire education online in 5 days. So we can change quick when we want to. So I say we haven't got time here. We need to change, and we have proved that we can change quickly. And I hope that we can do that again now. And you as leaders, you as deans in the health sector, have a wonderful opportunity to be a part of that change. And I would encourage you to take that opportunity. So thank you very much. And I'll stop there. Hopefully that's given some context, and happy now to have a conversation. Brian.
David, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for your honesty, and thank you for the transparency with which you're talking. I think that's been really helpful to the conversation. There are some questions in the chat box, and we'll come to them, and Katrina will facilitate that. But could I just start on a couple of points that you raised? And one of the points you raised was around government. And government, of course, we associate with policy and with change and with implementation. But given the fact that some of government may not believe in some of the issues that we're raising, what more do you think we can do to really put pressure on government to signify that change is needed?
Yeah, this was something I found quite difficult, and I'm not sure I approached it correctly, say a few months or even a year ago. When we published the report or the guidance, and members of Parliament were actively speaking against it, actually I found that quite upsetting, and actually I should have been ready for it but wasn't. I did interviews, and one particularly very, very difficult interview on talk radio, where really I was surprised by the language that was being used and the denial of the issues that we were talking about. And I suppose at first I thought, I'm going to ignore that and just continue leading the sector, and we're going to do this. I can't be distracted by that. Now I get emails, and I get contacted by groups like Don't Divide Us, which has many academics on it, and I need also to acknowledge the views that some in government have. I mean, if colleagues on the people on the Education Select Committee don't believe in the work that we're doing, we've got a problem. So my approach now is that we need to engage, and we need to try to understand why they have the view that they have, and try to help them understand why we have the view that we have. We may not be that far apart. Some of it might be just about the language, and they might be uncomfortable with the language of institutional racism that we use. I think it's the right language to use personally, but it may be that there are areas where we can kind of coalesce, if you like. I've written to all of my regional members of Parliament to tell them about the work that we're doing, and to reach out for to meet them and have conversations, because I want to lead change in the region as well. So you have to acknowledge that the Sun has 4 million readers. So when I get called Woke of the Week, I can't ignore that, because there's 4 million people that we need to bring with us. So I have changed my approach to that, really, and think it's not easy to engage with people who hold a rather different view, but we need to try to.
Thank you, David. I'll just pick up on another point, and then I'll hand over to Katrina to go to some of the questions. There's lots of actions that were suggested, or lots of good practice and guidance in the 10 points. I've realised that the higher I go in my career, how difficult it is to bring about change in an institution like a university. You think that people will just do everything you say or will follow, and that's not the case at all. It's really hard work to bring about change. But will actions alone bring really deep cultural change? What more do you think might be needed to really bring cultural change? And might be just useful to unpack what we mean really by cultural change, as opposed to some actions that may bring some change.
Yeah. So you can put actions in place very quickly. Actually, they won't be successful unless you bring cultural change. And it is that cultural change that I'm trying to lead at UEA, and that really is through engagement, and deep engagement at every level. So I'm in a position, obviously, to lead this, but my wider senior leadership team of 80 people or so, we do a lot of work together on this and what we need to do. I make sure that that's taking place in the schools through school executives and school boards. At our Welcome Week, when we every year in every university, depending on the size of the university, my university is 17,000 students, so every year we get 6,000 new students. In that Welcome Week, it's a moment to work with them, to help them understand the sort of culture we expect at UEA. Now, a number of those arriving recently have been in lockdown for a long time, and there's actually quite a lot of behavioural things we need to talk to them about. But this is the moment to do it. Now, it'll take 3 years, because this year we only get the 6,000. Next year there'll be another 6,000, then 12,000 will have had that sort of experience around it, and so on and so forth. So in 3 years' time, every student that's entered the university will have worked with us around the sort of culture that we expect. But that cultural change also needs to extend to our partners. you know, we have partnerships around the region, particularly with respect to health and medical, but also in many other disciplines. And of course, we have students that in pre-COVID times and hopefully post-COVID times are on internships, are on year abroads or spending some time abroad. So actually, they're still my students. So we need to actually work with partners to ensure that the culture that they're experiencing is of the kind that we would wish. And that's not easy. And I know I said earlier on, we haven't got time, we must bring change quickly. Well, clearly there's things that I have more control over around in my own institution compared to where I have with partner organizations, but I can still have a lot of influence over those partner organizations.
Thank you, David. I could probably ask you a lot more questions and I may come back, but it's really important that we hear from participants in the call this morning. So I'm going to hand over to Katerina, and if you could just take us to some of the key questions, that would be really great.
Thank you, and thank you to all for putting questions and comments in the Q&A and chat. We have had so far, I'd probably say four key themes in terms of the questions to you. The first one is around accountability, and ultimately, how do we hold both the higher education sector and the NHS in our case, or the healthcare sector, to account for structural racism, for example, disciplinary action disproportionately against Black students and staff. So that's just one question around accountability. Then there's another theme around language, and we've been using the term BAME quite a lot, but do we all recognize that for a lot of people, this is the wrong term, and the word minority almost sometimes refers to someone being inferior or indeed of lower esteem, if you like. So there's something about language and what is the most contemporary and appropriate language to use nowadays. And as a side comment to that, you know, how do we deal with microaggression as well when it comes to action and language vis-a-vis colleagues, students, wider stakeholders? The third theme is around leadership and networks. There are a lot of positive comments about your leadership, Professor Richardson, and how inspirational you are, both in terms of your honesty and authenticity, but also in terms of being clear about what action you want to take. And the question back to you is, how do we get more people in senior positions like yourselves? How do we get more white allies? What are the networks you are supporting, leading on, or generating through this discussion? And do we have more VCs like you? Do we have more senior leaders in higher education and research that we can look to and work as part of networks? And the final theme at the moment, and as I speak, I note that there are more questions coming, so I'll pause here and let you speak and then come back. But the fourth theme is around strategy and implementation. There is a view, and I think you mentioned that as well, that there is a over-strategizing trend. So people like to put out more strategies and more action plans or big kind of ideas, but then it's very difficult to implement. And you made it very clear about the timing is here and now, and you know, you can't just spend years talking and strategizing. So the question is, if you had 2 years to make a difference, what would you prioritize? What would you focus on in this agenda? And do you have any tips for effective implementation? So these four for the moment, and then I'll come back to you after that.
Gosh, I probably could spend an hour on those four alone. I was trying to make notes, and I might need you to remind me what they all were as we go through. But let me have a go. So I think the first point was around you know, tackling or helping our partners to tackle structural racism in their own institutions, in particular the NHS. If I captured it in a nutshell, and the point that you made was that you know, clear statistics show that there are more, for example, Black professionals in the NHS being disciplined than white professionals, and I'm familiar with that data. I don't know to what extent that, you know, the people on the call are involved with their partner NHS trusts. I've been on the board of mine for some time, and I set up a People and Culture Committee at the Norfolk and Orange University Hospital, which I chaired, and I used that to actually really get under, to get to grips with all of these issues, and first of all start to highlight that they did exist in the first place. So we did look at the discipline data. We did also look at the long listing and short listing data. Why were less black applicants getting taken to long list and to short list for particular senior roles than white applicants? So we started by exposing the data really and saying, this is telling us something, we need to tackle it. Actually, I did it with the NHS first before I did it in my own institution. Then, of course, I found the same data in my own institution. So we're also tackling it there. So I think the starting point was get the data, and then that's year one, and then begin to look at it and put it right year on year. So if I took the number of staff progressing from application, the number of, say, black applicants progressing from application through to shortlisting at UEA now, we've put that right. In that case, by thinking carefully about what our selection criteria are and asking whether they're discriminatory against people who haven't had the same opportunity prior to applying to UEA than say than somebody else. We've actually begun to move towards anonymous applications. Not easy, but some institutions have done that as well, or nominizing the applications. And I think we've been less stringent about essential criteria so that we can diversify the net in a way actually we found we couldn't if our essential criteria were too tight. So there's just a few things there. I mean, it's kind of random examples, but just ways in which you can sort of address some of these issues, and also, try to share the good practice that we've done at UEA with our NHS partners in these areas as well. We also try to bring we have a People and Culture group as well at UEA. So we now have one at the hospital and one at the university, and we get them to work together as well. And I get the chief exec of the hospital to come and talk to my students and listen to my students about the experiences that they're having, if you like, in his hospital as well. So just quite a lot of stuff that we try to do, really. Whether any of it makes a difference, it's not easy to measure that yet, but it's a good starting point for trying. You asked about terminologies, and you might have seen in one of my, and I'm actually dyslexic, so I can't read the chat very well, but I'm sensing that some of the links haven't come over properly. So I'm sure I could send those afterwards so we could distribute them. But one of the areas in the guidance that we produced was about terminology and creating common understandings. And we've had good conversations about this with Advance HE as well, with respect to the Race Equality Charter. And we've had conversations at UEA. I never use the BAME acronym, if it is an acronym, and I don't acknowledge that the existence of a BAME community. We do have Black members of the UEA community. We have Asian members, and I also understand that the term minority ethnic is not a good term. But people with, our one UEA community is enriched by everybody in it, and I prefer to take that one community approach. So you'll never hear me talk about a BAME community as some do. That said, I understand that we need to think about the words that we use. So we've had conversations about whether we should be using global majorities, for example, as a term. The rights and wrongs of using people of colour as a term. Now, the truth is, even in my Vice Chancellor's Tackling Racism Task Force, we can't get agreement on what terms we should use. So it is a difficult area, but we mustn't let that get in the way of us doing the work. And that's the advice that Advance HE give as well. You know, yes, we continue to have conversations. We feel that we see we can find a way through this, but get on with the work as well, because whatever terminologies you use, people are suffering, you know, racial harassment and racism. So work on that, but don't stop doing the action-based work to tackle racism. Did you raise microaggressions as well as part of that, or was that? Yes. So for microaggressions, I think that's where, you know, and I can see a point in the chat on that as well. I think that's where, as a white ally, that's really, you know, been a difficult area for me as well. I've done training on how to understand microaggressions and learn to recognize them in a way that actually I wouldn't have been able to necessarily understand and recognize them, say 3 years ago when I started off on this journey. And we incorporate that now into our white ally training that all of my senior leadership team do, or ally training. And not everyone on my senior leadership team is white, but most are, but the allyship training that we do. Difficult for me to, in a short space of time here, help you all, you know, understand that, but there are some good links, and I could send you some good links. What I think the sector needs is perhaps actually a sort of, if you like, an online course or a support course on white allyship that more of us can access. There isn't really one at the moment. We created our own at UEA, and then actually a number of other universities asked if we would share it with them, and we have, but it's actually quite time consuming because it's not off the shelf. It's actually better if it's given by somebody and it's interactive rather than something that you can do online. But I think that's where you know, that's where colleagues will need help, and I think that's where some of these things we've been hearing out of the issue, Yorkshire County Cricket Club, with players saying that they don't recall witnessing racism. That's because they don't recognise racial microaggressions. That's the whole point, actually, and that's the issue in itself. So that's where the education is really important. How to get more white allies? I suppose, I think, I hope, and I don't know, but by me standing there and as a white ally, trying to help others who perhaps are going to be uncomfortable being white allies, trying to help them be more comfortable. It's never comfortable, but try to help them be more comfortable. Try to help them understand that you will make mistakes, lots of them, but better that than not try at all. And on the whole, when you make a mistake, those who have had the lived experience of racism, racial harassment, if they believe in you, they will let you know you've made a mistake, whether it's the language you use or the approach that you've taken or the failure to recognize an example of structural racism. They'll help you if they believe in you. And so what I think I've done by standing up, you know, in front of the predominantly white leadership of the universities at UK meetings, etc., is to try and give confidence to others to take that lead. And so therefore, are there more VCs like me, was another question. Well, there are now, actually, yeah. And that gives me confidence that we can actually really make progress on this. There's lots of VCs, white VCs, who are now taking a lead. I'd like to see more, but I think gradually there will be more. And I've attended university executive boards. I've briefed other university councils. I'll go to other universities, if you like, in this virtual world and talk to their leadership teams about how my experiences might help them, you know, take forward their universities. Was there a point on strategy and implementation? Many of universities have put on hold their new 5-year plans because of COVID. Many would need it to be renewed. When I'm talking again on leadership platforms, University UK platforms, I'm encouraging universities as they work with their governing bodies on those new 5-year plans to make tackling racism and racial harassment a key part of their new strategic plans. And if it's a part of the strategic plan, then the leadership of the university needs to be reporting to the governing body on it. And if they're going to report the governing body on it and show progress in tackling racism, which will, include, for example, seeing the degree awarding gap disappear. If they're going to do that, they will have to resource it. So put it in the strategic plan, put the resource into the long-term financial plan, and make sure the governing body recognises their responsibility in making the Vice-Chancellor answerable to the progress at that point. If it's not the strategic plan, then you've got not necessarily the same sort of reporting structure. And again, I think a lot of VCs are going to make sure it is in the strategic plan. It certainly will be at UEA. I think that was probably a little bit whistle stop through, but there were a lot of questions there, and I might not have addressed them all satisfactorily, but I had a crack.
David, can I just go back and share with you a voice in the chat? And it's from Anthony, who says that as a straight, white, cisgender male, I found it difficult to identify microaggressions at times. And I worry that by that, I'm enabling people to express and hold views that are appropriate and contribute to the harm caused. So there is a sense there that actually we're not always aware sometimes of what the microaggressions are. And there was another comment in the question box that was saying, but in a reporting format in a university, people don't really report microaggressions. So how is reporting actually going to help? And that does seem to be a bit of a theme that's coming through. What would be your response to that?
So that does relate to the point that I was referring to that Gavin Williamson made. Unfortunately, he's not the Education Secretary anymore, but where he basically said we shouldn't be spending time putting in place reporting systems that allow people to report racial microaggressions. In his words that came out of his mouth. Well, I think we should, and encourage people to report racial microaggressions. If you're experiencing racial microaggression, you know you're experiencing it, and my job is to believe that you've experienced it. So we are actively encouraging it through our report and support system, and I would ask other universities to do the same. Now, many of those reports might be anonymous, and I'm okay with that. I mean, if they're not anonymous, then we can go and talk to the student, of course, and find out more about it. But if you're getting a lot of anonymous reports, but they're clustering around, for example, a particular hall of residence or a particular school of study or a particular, department in school of study, then it's telling you that something's happening that you're getting reports on, or it might be in a practical class, or you might see a cluster of reports that relate to a particular internship in one of the NHS partners. Even though they're anonymous, the pattern can help you take action. And so my advice to universities is to get people to believe in your report, show them that you use it, your reporting system, show that you do use it to support, and genuinely look at patterns in the data, and then act on those patterns and be seen to act on those patterns, and then review the extent to which your report and support system is helping you sort of tackle racism and racial harassment. Now, many report and support systems have only recently been put in place by universities. So that process of review, you probably have to let a year's cycle take place, but also talk to students who are using it and hear about their experiences of it, and see and use our student partners to help students to understand that we do want you to report racial microaggressions, and we will believe you. We really will.
Can I go back to the issue of the NHS, which many people in this call will be dealing with on a regular basis? And in other forums that we've had in the Council of Deans, we have heard many of our deans saying that some of their students come back and report racism within the NHS, inappropriate comments, maybe a tendency to fail rather than pass a student in a placement, which might be seen to be racially motivated. Partnership working is always difficult at the best of times. On that kind of level, David, what advice would you give to our deans and our PVCs in the call that might be having to manage faculties or departments where relationships with the NHS are strained and they might not feel they've got the power to do a lot of change at the most senior level, which you were talking about? What do you think we can do collectively there?
Because I haven't worked with a great number of trusts, I really have just worked with the trusts that I work with locally. What I've done is actually personally visit those trusts. But I mean, and of course, if I as Vice Chancellor say, and we've got students, health and nursing, allied health, nursing students, medics in lots of trusts in the region, not just the one that's on my campus, the Norfolk Norwich University Hospital. I actually, invite myself to go and visit and talk to them about the experiences that our students are having. I personally haven't received a lot of pushback. What I've received is understanding and acceptance that there are issues that the senior leadership of these partner trusts want to work with us on, but that's clearly not everybody's experience. Maybe this is where actually I do need, it might be that this is where you need to send the Vice Chancellor or President in and say that you were in a meeting with the VC of UEA and he's told you to get active on this and get the Chief Executive of the Trust and the Vice Chancellor together and talk this through. If, as I say, I mentioned that I've got the Chief Executive of, say, the Norfolk Norwich University Foundation Trust to come and meet the students who are having the experiences that they're having, to hear it firsthand. And it's difficult not to take action when you hear the students telling you. It really is. So maybe that's the thing we need to do, to get them together with the students and listen. And again, don't really say, now, was that really racism? Was that really a racial microaggression? Yes, it was. It was, because that's the experience that the student had. So that might be one approach I think that you could think about taking, really. And it's not just, of course, experiences that you get with respect to. So actually, another, I'm jumping around a bit, or not probably making any sense, but I invited myself to view the OSCEs because I was hearing that there were some issues in some of the OSCEs, which are the way some of our students were being treated. So I just said I want to go and spend a day viewing them, and I did. And I thought it was very helpful, because as a biochemist, I'd never actually seen how one was conducted before. But the very fact that I turned up and said why I was turning up did, I think, cause people to think about how they were doing them and whether there might be any issues and so on and so forth. So just showing that high level attention to this, I think maybe then caused, brought some focus to it. But of course, it's not one of the key things that our students experience, and you will know this, is actually racial abuse from patients. And that's a difficult one. That is a difficult one. And, working with, but the trusts are aware of that again, but what more can we do to help patients understand, what is not, acceptable behavior? I think that's a challenge. I don't have an answer to that, but it is something the trusts need to acknowledge and be aware of, and also be partners in tackling.
Yeah, thank you, David, and I couldn't agree more. And sadly, all too often, abuse in the NHS and in hospitals can occur, whether that's physical, verbal, homophobic, racist, whatever. It is part and parcel of the world that we live in. And for me, there's a real need there to equip our students and our staff with a skill set of communication in particular to challenge that, to stand up, to address it at the highest level. And in my experience, what I have found is that actually, if you bring the students together, they quite often have solutions for you because they have that lived experience. They can provide a really student-centered solution to this. David, I'm conscious of time. I'm going to squeeze in one last question, which is around allyship. And it's very simply to ask you, what do you think are the qualities of a good ally? What would you expect to see in a good ally?
You need to be able to listen. The starting point of a conversation is to believe. Why would we not believe? We don't have the lived experience, so to believe. It's not easy for people to talk about difficult experiences, as I said earlier on. It triggers memories. So it's listen, it's believe, and it's showing yourself able to act, and that's the key. Listen, believe, act, really, and be seen to act, and then people will trust you as an ally.
Thank you, David. And in the expressions expressed in one of the chats earlier on, can I thank you on behalf of the Council for your transparency and your preparedness to be a visible ally and leader in this area. It is something that we've really appreciated today. Catherine, I'm just going to hand over to you to tell us what's going to happen at the end of this. Can people access the recording today, etc., etc.? That would be really helpful.
Yes, thank you all for engaging today, but this is not the end of the activities. So this video of the webinar will be available to all of our members to view and advise. And if you want to use it in conversations or workshops within your own teams, feel free to do so. And hopefully the message will be used even further. But as I said, follow the Council of Deans Twitter or LinkedIn, because there will be further resources, including podcasts, blogs, and further webinars with the hashtag Race Equity Month, which goes throughout activities throughout November. So look forward to seeing more of you in one of our future events, and please engage with this debate. Thank you.
David, thank you.
So thank you for enabling me to have a conversation with you. And by the way, if there are other questions that we haven't had a chance to answer, if you wanted to send it to me in an email, I could have a crack at them, and then you can distribute them as well.
That's really helpful, David. Thank you very much. And as people are leaving the call, there's a little feedback poll just come up on the screen. If you could just click on that before you leave, that would be really helpful to us. Thank you very much for attending this morning. And at this point, we will say goodbye. Thank you very much.